Hi, I'm Angela. I have a husband with bipolar 2 disorder, my kids have ADHD, and I myself have struggled with depression. You're not alone. Okay. Well, I am really excited today to talk about how to handle additional crisis in the middle of the crisis that everyone is in the middle of this pandemic, because those regular life things don't go away. We don't get to hit pause on life in the middle of this, and so it's really important for us to really think about how we can address these things and still move forward and find healing in our lives. And so that's why I invited Rob Boyd here today. He has a lot of credentials that I could go into, but I'll just tell you briefly that he is currently a pastor, an ordained chaplain, and a trauma intervention instructor. It's amazing the work that he does as the clinical director of Southwest Washington's Critical Incident Stress Team. So it's a mouthful, but they do a lot of work and really have a great passion for helping people when they're in the middle of a crisis, and they do some amazing things to help prevent further trauma. And so I've seen this firsthand with people that I know personally, and so I'm excited to have Rob here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
So right now, everyone is experiencing kind of a common stress, a common crisis with this pandemic. And even though it's affecting everyone differently, we still have this common thing that's going on. And so it puts us at a heightened stress level. And, we can't prevent that necessarily. We're just kind of all in this together in some way. We might be in a different boat than the person down the street, but we're all kind of in this storm, I guess you could call it, together. And so what happens is people are already kind of on the edge. And then when another crisis hits, that's like an additional trauma or something, unexpected, that's pretty difficult to handle. So what exactly happens to us just in our bodies, in our, emotions and minds when we are kind of hit almost in a double whammy like that?
Yeah. So first thing I'd like to say is I'd like to ask a question, what do you call people with no stress? And the answer is dead, because we're all under stress all the time. There's stresses that we encounter, and there's different kinds of stress. There's eustress, which is a positive motivating stress. It's that when you have something that you want to do or that you're engaged in that you enjoy, and yet it's still a stress. Vacation is a great example. Vacation is wonderful, but even the planning of it and getting everything put together beforehand and making sure you haven't forgotten any of the details, these are all stressors, and they still count. And then we have what we call distress, which is when things are occurring that we would prefer not to have to deal with, but we have to. And then we finally come to the point where we call it dysfunction. And that's where the stressors, could be eustress and distress combined, have accumulated so much that we now come into the point where we don't function well, we don't think well, we don't plan well. And so what we're noticing in people right now is that there is a pile up of stress, which we call accumulative stress. Can be a bunch of little things. Right. In this case, we have some little things and some big things, which are cumulative. Or we have these very powerful events that kind of throw us off of our normal routine and our ability. So what we realize in stress is the worst combination is when they're prolonged and intense. And that's what we have right now. We have some intense stressors, and we have prolonged where we don't quite have an outcome yet of what these things are going to be. It's unresolved. So that's kind of why we find everybody right now, even for people who don't recognize that they're having these kind of stress responses in themselves. They simply are because of what we've got going on right now.
Yeah, and there's no kind of end date on it. It's not like, oh, well, on January 31st, it's just going to be fine. And move on with everything. And that's our end date. And so that's what we can count on. It's just like everything keeps getting put off. And so there's kind of an unknown, added to the stress, which really can be difficult. So I like that way you kind of broke down the different types of stress. And that's a perfect kind of a picture in our minds, because there are different ways of of really experiencing and seeing stress in our lives. So what have you seen in your work as like the greatest need that people are facing in the middle of this crisis right now?
Yeah, obviously from my pastoral standpoint, because I wear a few different hats, as you had mentioned,
Yeah.
our greatest need obviously is for communion with God and to trust in Him. And I think that holistic approach of understanding our Bibles is helpful because for those who do mental health, we can see in the Bible that there are times of extreme distress. We could even call it severe depression. We've seen that in multiple cases. We've seen suicide in the Bible. We've seen some very difficult things. And we realize that God tells us that there's trials that we're going to go through in this lifetime. But holistically, as we read that and we don't avoid those pieces that are complex, it helps us to relate with God and normalize our responses to a fallen world and a difficult situation. So I think that's obviously first from the pastoral hat. Now, if I was to switch hats, though, I would come back and say one of our greatest needs, if I could, I'd maybe break it up into three things. We need some more breaks. I think right now, a friend of mine, Pastor Jason from Richfield, said to me, I just believe at this point we need more Sabbath rest. We need times where we just let ourselves be still. We get a little more rest in all this because we're taking some pretty big hits, even physiologically. And so I would say that rest can be physical and it can be the opposite. Like for somebody like myself who sits in my office most of the time, sometimes when it comes to a break, I need a break from sitting and I got to get up and I got to go do something kind of with physical activity or some exertion. That helps. But I also think we need breaks from media and even from thoughts. We need to tell ourselves it's okay to think about the critical things that are going on, but it's also okay for us to say, I need to not think about the critical things going on right now. I need a break. Number two, I'd say self-care, do's and don'ts. What are things that are helpful to us and what are things that are not helpful? And I think a self-care list is something everybody should be making, especially in the mental health care field, but everybody in general, because there's things we do for ourselves that make us feel better when we are under a lot of stress. Walking, reading a book, even watching a good movie. Some people feel better if they watch a movie that makes them laugh. Others feel better if they watch a movie that might make them cry. Spending time in nature, kayaking. So I would tell people, take some time, actually give yourself a half hour, sit down with a cup of tea or coffee, could be decaffeinated if you need that right now, and write out 10 things that you would do for yourself that you count as helpful in reducing your stress. And then go back and post that somewhere where you could refer to it. And you might even want to write some things that you have tried in the past that have actually made it more stressful. Taking on a project you couldn't complete and then having more you stress behind you, things of that nature. So I think a self-care list is huge right now. And I really hope people will do that. And the other part I would say is human connection. And I know we're going to come back to that in a bit, but human connection is huge. And we'll maybe address a little bit more why physiologically that's important.
Yeah, there is a big why behind that. I think, sometimes we see not only for ourselves, so we just addressed that right now, but also when we see friends and family that are going through this and we want to feel like we can do something significant to reach out and help them. We've already talked about people, in previous interviews that I've done in this series, reaching out for a counselor, that can be of assistance. And that's definitely crucial. But there are other things that we can do, maybe at the beginning of a crisis incident, because, people can be in the middle of this pandemic and they can lose a job or they can lose a loved one. They can lose a friend because of disconnection. There's so many losses that can happen in regular life, but then added to what we're going through can be really difficult. So can you kind of speak to this as a chaplain? You will go into a middle of a situation where there can be some pretty devastating, crisis. And what do you see as like really great help in the middle of that, like right at the time, and then as time goes on?
Absolutely. Yeah, if I could, first thing I would say is I think it's really distressing to us when we don't know what to do. And
Mhm.
so I know your question was really what can we do for others, but having that answer actually serves on both sides of the equation because we don't want to do the wrong thing. And I think there's a lot of pressure and stress even in that regard. So if I could, I'll just break it up into three maybe simple things again. And the first one is time. Right now, people need some time. And I know that for some, as you had mentioned, they're busier than they've ever been, maybe because they work for UPS or Amazon right now and it's the holiday season,
Oh,
or because there were layoffs in other parts, they've had to pick up that load. And then we see the opposite side of the equation where people have lost all the meaningful activities, maybe even their workplace, their connections, they're going to church. And so time is a big piece. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You've heard that saying, nobody cares how much you know till they know how much you care. Well, usually that's expressed in time. And so just spending some time talking with people in whatever format you can, connecting with them, I think that's big. But in that time, I'd go to the second thing, which I think is really important, and that's listening. Quite frequently, when we see people hurting, if we don't know what to do, what we try to do is solve their problems for them, which means we're talking at them. It can even come across as lecturing.
yeah.
And what most people, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just try to fix it.
Yeah, yeah. And I give advice, and a lot of those advices are kind of come across as platitudes and they're actually not helpful when most people just need a little bit of time to verbally express what they're internally feeling. We say they need to put words to their indescribable experience. So a really good friend is better at listening than talking. And what they do is they'll actually facilitate a conversation where they draw out of that person more opportunities to let them say what they need to say, which is extremely helpful to somebody who's in a crisis situation. So I would say listening more than talking and giving advice is good. And it gives you a chance to validate that you hear them and to acknowledge that whatever they're experiencing is real for them, even if it wouldn't be real for you. Maybe it's really stressful to them and you go, wow, is that really such a big deal?
Yeah,
But to them, if it is, to acknowledge that is big. And then finally, I'd say the last thing is helping them find their own solutions as opposed to telling them what to do. When something happens and you feel overwhelmed, there's a sense of a loss of personal power to make decisions, power to move forward, power to return to what we call adaptive functioning. And so what we want to do is help people find their own solutions by asking, well, what have you done in the past that's helped? Or what do you think would be helpful now? Or what might make this more intense? But helping them find their own solutions, I think, is really important as opposed to just telling them what to do.
Yeah, because there is a sense of even in the middle of this, you feel like you don't have any power or control, and
Yeah.
there is like a loss of purpose sometimes. And I think really knowing there is something you can do to advocate for yourself, there is something that you know inside yourself that will help you. And so just making some of those decisions for yourself is great. And yeah, that listening and then asking good questions is a big part of being a good friend and being a family member that someone wants to have around.
Yeah,
Rather
exactly.
than someone who's like, oh, here she comes. Yeah, the girl with all the answers or the guy with all the answers. So yeah,
Yeah,
great point, Rob. I love
thank
that.
you.
So I'd love to hear what you think about as far as the role of connecting together as followers of Jesus. Things are really, all over the map as far as the choices of different churches and how they are navigating that with the different, all over the country, there are different rules and regulations and, everybody has those things. So setting that aside, what do you feel will really help people that are really trying to find community and when they're in these stressful situations, how does that foster an ability to have resilience and to really find healing in these times. I'd love to hear even like an example, a story that you could share from your experiences. Yeah, that'd be great.
If I could, I would maybe define resistance, resilience, and recovery. These are words that show up a lot in the mental health aspect. And resistance is kind of like having psychological immunity. It's, we talk a lot about antibodies right now for different diseases, particularly COVID. And some people just have more resistance to trauma and stress. They do better. But that resilience is the bounce back factor. When you do get hit, how quickly can you get back up? And when we talk about community, this plays a huge role. So if I could, I'd just give some statistics. In the 1970s, we had a Dr. Bruce Alexander who came with the rat park experiment. And what he was trying to do is show that opioids have certain interactions with people based on relationships. So they first take a rat and they put them in a cage with two sources of water. One has heroin, one is just regular water, and a treadmill. And when they leave the rat in that situation, he returns over and over again to the opioid water and then eventually runs himself to death. And so then what the doctor decided he would do was now introduce those rats in community. And he would take one rat and put them in community, and for a couple hours a day, put it in the cage by itself again, just like the previous rats, and give it two choices of water. And what we found is those rats would almost never return back to the opioid water because they had community. And that's huge. And I think a lot of people underestimate the need of community and the response on our mental health. And so when you have zero of those rats running themselves to death, returning to this destructive condition because of community, I know we're not rats, but I think we could learn something, and I hope we have. And then we can kind of see from common case study right now that if you've been reading, in Japan, they did a suicide study there for November.
Right.
And what they realized is in November, they had more suicides in November than they had in all deaths from the COVID-19. And again, I've tried to look up these stats again today. I think I have them right, but forgive me if I don't. I believe they've had 1,300 overall deaths from suicide or from COVID. And in November, they're at 30,000 suicides. And so what we realize is the mental health aspect is largely being ignored by many when it seems to be the bigger issue. Our CDC produced a publication in June that said 1 in 4 young adults ages 18 to 24 have seriously considered suicide during the COVID-19 lockdowns and isolation.
Just think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a staggering number. I mean, it's a staggering statistic that is, again, not being implemented enough in determining policy. So when we talk about interactions of people with people, it's important. Even if we go back to Genesis 2:18, we find that God's walking in the garden with Adam. Right. He's there with them. So the God and Adam are together in a way that I think many of us are envious of at this point. So we can't say that that's missing. But then he comes in 2:18 and he says, and it's not good for man to be alone. So I'm going to make you a helpmate. What I find interesting is before the helpmate, though, the next thing he does is he creates all the animals and he puts an interaction between Adam and the animals where he's naming them and he's interacting with them. And then he creates a woman to be his helpmate. And I find this all fascinating because God says it's not good for man to be alone, but he wasn't missing a relationship with God. That was very intimate. Yeah. He was missing interaction with other living beings, organisms. Right. Man, animal, all that together. And so God solves the problem. And I think we have to come back and say, wow, this is really important for us. God did not create us to live by ourselves. So I know some people have relationships inside their homes that they're in. Others don't. They don't even have animals. And I think that interaction's big. We know that connections and relationships with people in terms of physical touch are really big. When we touch somebody, hug them or touch them or shake their hand, we're releasing oxytocin, which is called the bonding hormone. And it releases more hormones like serotonin and dopamine, which are the good, feel good, pleasure hormones. And at the same time, it suppresses cortisol and norepinephrine, which are the stress release chemicals in our brain. Yeah. And so we know that this kind of interaction and touching, if possible, is extremely important in mental health. The chemicals that God created in our brain are released in community and in interaction and in touch. And so they're really important. So I would say one of the pieces that's really important for us right now is to realize that, yes, there are always health emergencies that take place. They have never gone away. And many of them are viral or mycoplasma-like organisms that can move around. But without human interaction, I think we are having the greater crisis. So I would say be responsible, make good decisions. But some of those good decisions have to be that we come together, we congregate, we meet, we touch. And for myself personally, I think that is the greater crisis that we have at this point. And therefore, I simply have to say no to some things that I would disagree with, because I see the results are kind of getting staggering at this point. And I don't think they have been fully revealed as to the amount of mental health crisis we're going to have.
Right. And in the long term, I mean, speaking from our experience at His Heart Foundation, we have had a 40% increase in counseling referral requests this year, and have had such a greater increase in the need for teens and children to see counselors. And really the biggest thing is that sense of anxiety and depression, suicidality. It is so heartbreaking to see those things happening in our youth. And that statistic from the CDC really does say it all. And so hard to watch that happen. Yet we know that there is hope in Christ, in connection, and in reaching out for help. And so I think your insight is really amazing, Rob. I love the way that you were able to break it down for us. And I think that we know that we don't have to go this alone. And that's a really important thing to remember. And so as each person is weighing their decisions based on different circumstances, we need to remember that there are all kinds of creative ways to be able to reach out in community. And we really encourage you to do that. And so thank you so much for just helping us look at crisis, kind of our double crisis that is happening right now for many people, and just encouraging with, those things that really can bring us hope. And so thanks so much, Rob. We were just so appreciative of you coming and being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for the time. It was an honor to be able to share, and I hope it's helpful.
It definitely was. Thanks so much.
And a big thank you to His Heart for supporting this channel. If you want more information for you and those you love on mental health, go to mentalhealth.academy today.